An elderly couple living on Social Security opened a letter from France and discovered they'd inherited a 12th-century castle. But what they found hidden in its sealed attic would shake governments, rewrite history, and reveal a fortune worth $265 million in gold. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog rolled through the hills of Cedar Falls, Tennessee, slow and heavy like it always did in late October. The kind of fog that made everything feel smaller, quieter, like the whole world had shrunk down to just a handful of houses and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. In a modest two-bedroom house at the end of Mulberry Lane, Harold and Ruth sat at their kitchen table the way they had for nearly 50 years of marriage. The linoleum floor beneath them was cracked in 3 places. The ceiling above had a water stain shaped like a kidney bean, growing darker every time it rained. The coffee maker on the counter gurgled and hissed, older than most of their grandchildren. Ruth, 73 years old, with silver hair pinned back in a loose bun and hands that still remembered how to knead bread even when the arthritis flared, poured 2 cups of black coffee and set one in front of her husband. Harold, 75, broad-shouldered but stooped now from decades of factory work, accepted it without looking up from the pile of envelopes in front of him. Bills. Always bills. The electric company wanted $147. The pharmacy wanted $62 for Ruth's blood pressure medication. The county had sent another notice about property taxes, the 3rd one this year, politely threatening consequences if they didn't catch up soon. Harold rubbed his forehead and sighed. We're going to have to skip the furnace repair again. Ruth sat down across from him, her chair creaking against the floor. It's not that cold yet. We've got the space heaters. Space heaters cost money too. I know. They sat in silence for a while, the way old married couples do when words have run out, but understanding hasn't. 51 years together. 3 children raised, all grown now, scattered across the country with their own struggles, their own bills, their own lives too full to notice that Mom and Dad were quietly drowning. Harold had worked 38 years at the textile mill before it closed. Ruth had cleaned houses, babysat neighborhood kids, taken in sewing, whatever kept food on the table while raising their own. They'd never been rich, never even been comfortable, but they'd been proud. They'd paid their debts, kept their promises, shown up every single day. And now, at the end of it all, they were 2 years behind on property taxes and praying the roof held through another winter. Harold flipped through the remaining envelopes. Junk mail, mostly. A credit card offer addressed to someone who'd never lived there. A flyer for a church bake sale. And then, at the bottom of the stack, something different. He pulled it out slowly. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, expensive-looking. The kind of paper that didn't come from Office Depot. In the upper left corner, an address in France. The stamp was foreign, marked with a faded postmark he couldn't quite read. "What's that?" Ruth asked. Harold turned it over. His name was printed in neat, formal script. Mr. Harold Whitfield, 17 Mulberry Lane, Cedar Falls, Tennessee, United States of America. "No idea," he muttered. He slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out several pages of crisp, heavy paper. The first was a letter, typed in English, but clearly written by someone for whom English was not a first language. Formal, stiff, precise. "Dear Mr. Whitfield, it is with respectful intention that I contact you regarding a matter of inheritance. My name is Monsieur Jean-Pierre Delacroix, notaire in the village of Saint-Émile-sur-Loire, in the Burgundy region of France. I have been retained to settle the estate of the late Mr. Augustin Whitfield, who passed from this life on the 14th of June of this year at the age of 97. After extensive genealogical research, it has been determined that you, Mr. Harold Whitfield, are the sole surviving heir of Mr. Augustin Whitfield, who was your father's uncle, your great-uncle by blood. As such, you are entitled to inherit his estate in full, including the property known as Château de la Pierre Dorée, a 12th-century castle located in the commune of Saint-Émile-sur-Loire. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience to discuss the terms and conditions of this inheritance. Enclosed, you will find documentation verifying my credentials and the legitimacy of this matter. With sincere regards, Jean-Pierre Delacroix, notaire. Harold read it twice, then a third time. His hands had started to tremble somewhere around the word castle. "Harold," Ruth's voice was tight. "What does it say?" He set the letter down and looked at her. His face had gone pale. "It says I inherited a castle." Ruth blinked. "A what? A castle? In France? From some great uncle I never knew existed?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The coffee maker gurgled one last time and went silent. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. Then Ruth let out a short, sharp laugh. "It's a scam." "Probably," Harold agreed. "Has to be. Those Nigerian prince things, you know. They want your bank account information." "Probably," he said again, but something in his voice wavered. Ruth reached across the table and took the letter from his hands. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, the way they always did when she was concentrating. When she finished, she set it down and picked up the other documents. There were copies of official records, birth certificates, death certificates, genealogical charts tracing a family line back through generations. There was a photograph, old and faded, of a man who looked startlingly like Harold's father. Same jaw, same deep-set eyes, same serious expression. And there was a photograph of the castle. Ruth's breath caught. It was enormous. Stone walls rising from a hillside, towers reaching toward a grey French sky, windows like dark eyes watching across centuries. It looked ancient, impossible, like something from a fairy tale or a history book. "Harold," she whispered, "this looks real." He took the photograph from her and stared at it. His father had never talked much about the old country. Had mentioned once, maybe twice, that there was family back in France, distant cousins or something, but nothing more. Certainly nothing about castles or inheritances or great-uncles named Augustin. "We should call someone," Ruth said. "Make sure it's not a trick." Harold nodded slowly. "We should." But neither of them moved. They just sat there, two tired people in a tired house, holding a photograph of something that couldn't possibly be theirs. It took 3 weeks to verify. 3 weeks of phone calls to the French consulate, to lawyers who charged by the hour, to genealogical services that confirmed what the notary's documents already showed. 3 weeks of sleepless nights and whispered conversations and growing disbelief. Augustin Whitfield had been real. He had been Harold's father's uncle, the younger brother who stayed behind when the rest of the family emigrated to America in 1923. He had lived alone in that castle for decades, a recluse, a mystery, a man who never married, never had children, and apparently never told anyone that he had relatives across the ocean. He had died at 97 years old, alone, and the castle had passed to his only living heir, Harold. "I don't understand," Harold said for perhaps the 100th time. He was sitting in the cramped office of a lawyer in Nashville, a young woman named Patricia, who specialized in international estate law and had agreed to take their case for a reduced fee after hearing their story. "Your great-uncle was what we call an intestate decedent," Patricia explained. "He died without a will. Under French law, that means his estate passes to his nearest living relative. The notary traced the family line, and you're it, Mr. Whitfield. You're the only one left." Ruth squeezed Harold's hand. "But we never even knew he existed." "That's not uncommon in these situations. Families split apart, lose contact, especially across generations and oceans. The important thing is that the documentation is legitimate. I've verified it independently. This is real." Harold let out a long breath. "So what happens now?" Patricia folded her hands on the desk. "Well, that's where it gets complicated. The castle, Château de la Pierre Dorée, has been abandoned for over 40 years. Your great-uncle lived there alone, but he stopped maintaining it decades ago. The property has fallen into significant disrepair. How significant? Ruth asked. Patricia hesitated. The roof has collapsed in several sections. There's water damage, structural instability, overgrown grounds. The French government has classified it as a heritage site, which means there are strict regulations about what can and can't be done with it. And the taxes? Harold asked, because he knew there were always taxes. Your great-uncle stopped paying property taxes in 1989. The accumulated debt plus interest and penalties comes to approximately €320,000. That's roughly $350,000. The number hung in the air like a guillotine. Ruth's face went white. We don't have that kind of money. We don't have any money. I understand, Patricia said gently. You have options. You could renounce the inheritance entirely, walk away, let the French government seize the property for back taxes. Or you could try to sell it as is, though the debt and the condition make that difficult. Or, she paused. Or, Harold prompted. Or you could go there, see it for yourself. The notary mentioned that the estate includes the contents of the castle as well, not just the structure. Sometimes these old properties have assets inside, furniture, artwork, antiques, that can be sold to offset debts. It might be worth investigating before you make a final decision. Harold and Ruth looked at each other. A silent conversation passed between them, the kind that only 51 years of marriage could produce. $350,000 in debt, a crumbling castle on the other side of the world, a great uncle who had lived and died as a stranger. It was madness to even consider it. How much are plane tickets to France? Harold asked. Ruth closed her eyes. Harold, I'm just asking. Patricia pulled up something on her computer. Round trip from Nashville to Lyon, which is the closest major airport. You're looking at about $800 each if you book in advance. $1,600, more than their monthly income, more than they could afford. But Harold was already thinking about the photograph, the castle rising from the hillside, the towers reaching toward the sky, his father's face in that old, faded picture. We have to go, he said quietly. I have to see it. Ruth opened her eyes and looked at him. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she nodded. Then we'll go, she said. We'll figure out the money somehow. We always do. They took out a small loan against the house, the same house they'd almost lost twice already, and booked the cheapest flights they could find. Ruth packed a single suitcase for both of them, clothes for 1 week, toiletries, her blood pressure medication, Harold's heart pills. She tucked the photograph of the castle into the front pocket where she could look at it on the plane. Neither of them had ever been to Europe. Neither of them had ever been much of anywhere, really, except for that one trip to Florida in 1982, when the kids were still young and gas was cheap and the world felt full of possibilities. Now they were 73 and 75 years old, exhausted and broke and scared, flying across an ocean to claim a castle they couldn't afford from a man they'd never met. This is crazy, Ruth said as the plane lifted off. Harold took her hand. Probably. We're too old for this. Probably. She leaned her head against his shoulder. But we're doing it anyway. He smiled just slightly. We always do. The flight was long and uncomfortable. Harold's knees ached from being cramped into economy seats. Ruth couldn't sleep, just dozed fitfully and woke with a stiff neck. By the time they landed in Lyon, they were exhausted, disoriented, and deeply uncertain about what they were doing. A rental car was waiting for them, arranged by the notary, paid for in advance from the estate's frozen accounts. Harold hadn't driven a foreign car in a foreign country in his entire life, but he climbed behind the wheel anyway, gripping it tight, following the GP's directions through countryside that looked nothing like Tennessee. The drive took nearly 3 hours. They passed through rolling hills covered in vineyards, small villages with stone houses and narrow streets, fields of sunflowers bowing under the autumn sun. It was beautiful. impossibly beautiful. And Ruth pressed her face to the window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. "Harold," she whispered, "look at this place." He glanced over, then back at the road. "I see it. It's like a painting." "I know." The GPS announced they were approaching their destination. Harold slowed the car as the road narrowed, climbing up a gentle hill lined with ancient oak trees. And then, as they crested the rise, he stopped the car entirely. Ruth gasped. There it was, Château de la Pierre Dorée, the Castle of the Golden Stone. It rose from the hillside like something out of a dream. Massive stone walls weathered by 800 years of wind and rain and war. Towers at each corner, one of them partially collapsed, the others standing defiant against the sky. Windows that had once held glass now gaped empty, dark mouths watching their approach. Ivy crawled up the eastern wall, thick and green, reclaiming what humans had built. The grounds were overgrown, wild with weeds and brambles and saplings that had sprouted in the decades since anyone had tended them. A fountain in the courtyard stood dry, its basin cracked, a stone angel at its center missing one wing. It was ruined. It was magnificent. It was impossible. Harold turned off the engine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "Harold," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this is yours." He shook his head slowly. "No, this is ours." They got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, their footsteps crunching on gravel that hadn't been raked in 40 years. The main door was massive, oak reinforced with iron, and it stood slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry and never come back. Harold pushed it open. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that echoed through the vast entrance hall beyond. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light that pierced through broken windows. The floor was stone, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A grand staircase swept upward, its banister thick with cobwebs. Portraits hung on the walls, their subjects obscured by grime and age. Ruth reached for Harold's hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "I can't believe this is real," she said. Harold squeezed her hand. "Me neither." They walked deeper into the castle, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Room after room revealed itself. A library with shelves of mouldering books, a dining hall with a table long enough to seat 30, a kitchen with copper pots still hanging from hooks above a cold hearth. Everything was covered in dust. Everything was frozen in time. It was like walking through a photograph, stepping into a moment that had been waiting, patient and still, for someone to finally arrive. In the library, Ruth found a photograph on the mantelpiece. She picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust with her sleeve. A young man stared back at her. Dark hair, serious eyes, a formal suit that looked like it belonged to another century. Written on the back in faded ink, Augustine, 1922. "Harold," she said softly. "Come look." He crossed the room and took the photograph. His breath caught. "He looks just like my father," he whispered. "Exactly like him." They stood there together, holding a picture of a man who had lived and died alone in this castle, a man who had been family but never family, connected by blood but separated by an ocean and a century of silence. Harold's eyes glistened. Why didn't he ever reach out? Why didn't he tell anyone? Ruth had no answer. Some questions had no answers. The sound of a car engine broke the silence. They turned, startled, as footsteps approached the front door. A man appeared in the entrance hall, small, precise, wearing a grey suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His hair was thinning, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Monsieur Whitfield?" he asked, his accent thick but his English clear. Harold stepped forward. "Yes, that's me." The man extended his hand. "Jean-Pierre Delacroix, the notary. I am pleased you have come." They shook hands. Ruth introduced herself, and Monsieur Delacroix bowed slightly, a gesture of old-world courtesy. "Please," he said, gesturing toward a sitting room off the main hall. "Let us talk. There is much to discuss." They sat on furniture covered in dust cloths, the fabric releasing small clouds with every movement. Monsieur Delacroix opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder of documents. "As you can see," he began, "the chateau is in considerable disrepair. Your great-uncle lived here alone for many decades, but he was, how do you say, a private man. He did not welcome visitors. He did not maintain the property. In his final years, he rarely left the East Wing." "Why?" Ruth asked. "Why would anyone choose to live like that?" Monsieur Delacroix hesitated. "That is a question many in the village have asked. Augustin Whitfield was something of a legend here, but not a happy one. People whispered that he was guarding something, that the castle held secrets he would not share." Harold frowned. "Secrets? What kind of secrets?" The notary shrugged, a very French gesture. "I do not know, monsieur. Perhaps it was only the imagination of villagers with too much time, but your great-uncle was adamant about one thing. The attic was never to be opened. He sealed it himself, decades ago, boarded the door, changed the locks, forbade anyone from entering." "The attic?" Ruth repeated. "Yes, madame. The highest room in the East Tower. No one has been inside since 1979. Harold and Ruth exchanged a glance. The same thought passed between them, unspoken but clear. "What was he hiding?" Monsieur Delacroix continued. "I must be honest with you, Monsieur Whitfield. The debts on this property are significant. The French government is pressuring for resolution. If you cannot pay the back taxes within 6 months, they will seize the chateau and sell it at auction." $350,000, Harold said flatly. "Approximately, yes. I understand this is a considerable sum." "Considerable." Harold almost laughed. It might as well have been 350 million. They didn't have it. They would never have it. "What are our options?" Ruth asked. "You could renounce the inheritance, walk away. The debt would be absorbed by the state, and you would owe nothing. Or you could attempt to sell the property, though finding a buyer willing to take on such a project is challenging. Or—" He paused, just as the lawyer in Nashville had paused. "Or," Harold prompted, "or you could explore the chateau more thoroughly. As I mentioned, the estate includes all contents. Your great-uncle collected many things over the years. Antiques, perhaps, artwork, items of value that might be sold to offset the debt." He hesitated again. "And there is always the matter of the attic." The word hung in the air. "You think there's something up there?" Ruth said. Monsieur Delacroix spread his hands. "I think your great-uncle was a man of secrets, madame. I think he spent his entire life protecting something. Whether that something has value, only you can discover." Harold looked around the dusty sitting room, at the crumbling walls and broken windows, at the portrait of a stern-faced ancestor watching from above the fireplace. They had come here expecting to sign papers and walk away. To see the castle once, shake their heads at the impossibility of it, and return to their quiet life of bills and borrowed time. But now something had shifted. Something had taken root. "We'll stay," Harold said. "1 week. We'll explore the castle, see what's here, and then we'll decide." Ruth nodded slowly. 1 week. Monsieur Delacroix smiled, just slightly. "Very good, monsieur. I will arrange for the electricity to be restored and supplies to be delivered. The East Wing is the most habitable. Your great-uncle's quarters are there. You may find them interesting." He stood, gathered his papers, and shook their hands again. "One more thing," he said at the door. "The villagers, they will be curious about you. They have waited a long time to learn what Augustin Whitfield was protecting. Some believed it was nothing. Others believed it was everything." He paused. "Perhaps you will finally give them an answer." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the stone corridor, leaving Harold and Ruth alone in a castle that had kept its secrets for nearly a century. Ruth turned to her husband. Her eyes were bright, Her cheeks flushed despite the cold. "Harold," she said, "what have we gotten ourselves into?" He looked at her, this woman he'd loved for more than half a century, who had stood beside him through poverty and struggle and endless small defeats, who had never once complained, never once given up, never once stopped believing that tomorrow might be better than today. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we're about to find out." That night, they slept in Augustine's old bedroom, wrapped in blankets they'd found in a cedar chest, listening to the wind howl through the broken towers above them. Ruth dreamed of stone corridors and locked doors. Harold dreamed of his father's face, young and serious, staring at him from across the years. And somewhere high above them, in the sealed and silent attic, something waited. Something that had been hidden for decades. Something worth killing for. Something that would change their lives forever. The morning light crept through the cracked shutters of Augustine's bedroom, casting long golden streaks across the stone floor. Ruth woke first, disoriented, her body stiff from sleeping on a mattress that had seen better decades. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The flight, the drive, the castle rising from the hillside like something out of a fever dream. She turned to look at Harold, still sleeping beside her, his breathing slow and steady. In the soft morning light, he looked younger somehow, the lines on his face smoothed by shadow. She remembered him at 24, the day they met at the county fair, how he'd won her a stuffed bear at the ring toss and blushed when he handed it to her. 51 years. 51 years of bills and babies and broken washing machines and borrowed hope. And now this. A castle in France. A mystery sealed in an attic, a fortune in debt they couldn't pay. She slipped out of bed quietly, wrapping one of the old blankets around her shoulders like a shawl. The floor was ice-cold beneath her bare feet. She crossed to the window and pushed open the shutters. The view stole her breath. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, covered in the gold and amber of autumn vineyards. A river wound through the valley below, silver in the early light. Church steeples rose from distant villages, and somewhere a rooster crowed, its call echoing across the centuries-old landscape. "Ruth!" She turned. Harold was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "Come look," she said softly. He joined her at the window, and they stood together in silence, watching the sun rise over a world that felt impossibly far from Cedar Falls, Tennessee. "It's beautiful," Harold murmured. "It's ours," Ruth replied. "At least for now." They found the kitchen after some searching, a vast room with stone walls and copper pots hanging from iron hooks above a hearth large enough to roast a whole pig. Monsieur Delacroix had been true to his word. A box of supplies sat on the ancient wooden table delivered sometime in the early hours. Bread, cheese, fruit, coffee, and a bottle of wine with a note that simply read "Bienvenue." Ruth made coffee on a small camping stove they'd brought from home, not trusting the castle's ancient fixtures. They ate breakfast in silence, still processing the enormity of where they were and what they faced. "We should start exploring," Harold said finally. "If there's anything valuable in this place, we need to find it." Ruth nodded. "Where do we begin?" Harold looked around the cavernous kitchen at the doorways leading off in 3 different directions. "I suppose we just pick a direction and start walking." They chose the west wing first. The corridors were long and shadowed, lit only by whatever light filtered through dirty windows and gaps in the shutters. Their footsteps echoed on stone floors worn smooth by 800 years of footsteps before theirs. Every few meters, portraits hung on the walls, men and women in formal dress, their eyes seeming to follow as Harold and Ruth passed. "These must be the family," Ruth said, pausing before a painting of a woman in a blue gown. "Your family." Harold studied the portrait. The woman had dark hair and a stern expression, her hands folded primly in her lap. A small plaque at the bottom of the frame read, "Marguerite Whitfield, 1847. "I never knew any of this existed," he said quietly. My father never talked about France, never talked about any family back here. I always assumed there was no one left." "Maybe he didn't know either," Ruth suggested. "Maybe it was all lost before he was even born." They moved on, room by room, opening doors that hadn't been opened in decades. A music room with a grand piano covered in dust, its keys yellowed and silent. A sitting room with furniture draped in white cloths like ghosts frozen mid-dance. A study lined with bookshelves, the leather spines cracked and faded, titles in French that neither of them could read. In the study, Harold found the first clue. He was examining a desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and old photographs, when his hand brushed against something hidden in a drawer. He pulled it out carefully, a leather journal, its cover worn soft with age. "Ruth, look at this." She crossed the room and peered over his shoulder as he opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, small and precise in French, but tucked between the pages were photographs, letters, documents that told their own story even without translation. The first photograph showed a family gathered on the castle steps, a man, a woman, and 3 children, all dressed in the fashion of the early 1900s. The man had Harold's jaw, the same serious set to his eyes. "That must be your great-grandfather," Ruth said. "Augustine's father." Harold nodded slowly. He turned the page and found a letter, this one in English, dated March 15, 1923. "My dearest brother, I write to you from the ship, 3 days out from Le Havre. The crossing has been rough, but my spirits are high. America awaits, and with it, a new life for my family. I know you think me foolish for leaving, but there is nothing left for us in France. The war took too much. The old world is dying, Augustine. The new world is being born. I leave the chateau in your care. Protect it. Protect what our family has built. And if the darkness comes again, and I fear it will, remember what Father told us. The highest room holds our legacy. Guard it with your life. Your brother always, Henri." Harold's hands trembled as he held the letter. Henri, his grandfather. The man who had brought the family to America, who had started over with nothing, who had never spoken of what he'd left behind. "The highest room," Ruth repeated softly. "The attic." "He knew," Harold said. "My grandfather knew there was something up there, something worth protecting." They spent the rest of the morning searching the study, pulling books from shelves, opening drawers, looking for more clues. They found letters spanning decades, correspondence between Henri and Augustin that grew less frequent as the years passed, then stopped entirely in 1939. The last letter from Henri was dated August 22, 1939. "Dear Augustine, war is coming again. I can feel it, even from across the ocean. I beg you, protect what must be protected. Do not let them take it. Do not let them even know it exists. Seal it away if you must. The highest room must remain untouched until the danger has passed. If something happens to me, know that I have told no one here about our legacy. It is safer that way. Some secrets are too heavy for the new world to carry. God keep you, brother. God keep us all. Henri." After that, nothing. No more letters from Henri, and Augustin's journal entries became sparse, cryptic, paranoid. September 1st, 1939, one entry read, "The Germans have invaded Poland." It begins again. June 14th, 1940. "Paris has fallen. They will come here next. I have sealed the highest room as Henri instructed. No one must know. November 3rd, 1942. Soldiers came today, asked questions, showed them nothing. They suspect, but they cannot prove. I will die before I tell them." Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. Harold, what was he hiding? What could be so important that he'd rather die than reveal it? Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's still up there. The notary said no one's been in that attic since 1979. 45 years, Ruth whispered. 45 years of waiting. That afternoon, they ventured into the village. Saint-Émile-sur-Loire was small, barely more than a church, a cafe, a bakery, and a handful of stone houses clustered around a central square. The moment Harold and Ruth appeared, conversation stopped. Eyes followed them as they walked, curious, wary, assessing. They found a table at the cafe and ordered coffee in halting French. The owner, a heavy-set woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, studied them openly. "You are the Americans," she said in English, "the ones who inherited the chateau." Harold nodded. "Yes, ma'am, we are." She made a sound that might have been approval or might have been something else entirely. Augustin Whitfield. He was a strange man, lived alone in that castle for longer than most people in this village have been alive. "Did you know him?" Ruth asked. The woman shrugged. Everyone knew of him. No one knew him. He came into the village once a month for supplies, never spoke more than necessary, never invited anyone to the chateau. She paused, lowering her voice. People said he was guarding something from the war. "The war?" Harold leaned forward. "World War II?" "Yes, the Germans occupied this region, you know, took over the big houses, the estates, but not the Château de la Pierre Dorée. They came once, searched the place from top to bottom, but they found nothing." She smiled thinly. "Augustin was clever. Whatever he was hiding, they never found it." "What do you think he was hiding?" Ruth asked. The woman's eyes flickered, just for a moment. "Gold," she said quietly. "That is what people say. Gold hidden during the war. Jewish families fleeing the Nazis, they say, gave their valuables to trusted friends for safekeeping. Some say Augustin Whitfield was one of those friends." Harold and Ruth exchanged glances. Gold, hidden for 80 years, protected by a man who had died alone, never telling anyone the truth. "But they are just stories," the woman added quickly. "Village gossip. Probably nothing." Probably nothing, but her eyes said something different. What happens next will turn this journey upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest places hold the most powerful secrets. Stay tuned to see what they discover. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Harold and Ruth climbed to the East Tower. The stairs were narrow and winding, carved into the stone itself, worn down by centuries of footsteps. Ruth had to stop twice to catch her breath, her hand pressed against the cold wall. Harold waited each time, patient, his own knees aching with every step. Finally, they reached the top. The corridor was dark, lit only by a single window at the far end. Dust motes swirled in the fading light, and there, at the end of the hallway, stood a door. But it wasn't just a door. It had been fortified. Heavy wooden planks had been nailed across it, forming an X pattern. Iron brackets reinforced the frame, and in the center, where a normal lock would be, there was something else. A heavy padlock, rusted but solid, and beside it a second lock, this one older, more ornate. "He wasn't just hiding something," Ruth breathed. "He was protecting it." Harold ran his fingers along the wood. The planks were thick, solid. This wasn't the work of a few hours. This was deliberate, methodical, built to last. "We need tools," he said. "Serious tools, crowbars, maybe a saw. This isn't going to open easily." Ruth nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the second lock, the ornate one. "Harold, look at this. Look at the design." He leaned closer. The lock was old, far older than the padlock beside it. Its surface was decorated with intricate engravings, flowers, vines, and in the center, a family crest, the Whitfield crest. "This lock is original," Harold said slowly. "It's been here since the castle was built, 800 years. "Which means there's a key," Ruth said. "Somewhere in this castle, there's a key that opens this lock." They spent the next 3 days searching. They went through every room they could access, opening drawers, checking behind paintings, feeling along walls for hidden compartments. They found more photographs, more letters, more evidence of a family that had once been wealthy, prominent, connected to the highest circles of French society. They found receipts from before the war, purchases of artwork, jewelry, silver. They found bank statements showing accounts that had been emptied in 1939, massive sums withdrawn in cash. They found a list, handwritten in Augustine's careful script, of names and addresses, Jewish families from Paris, Lyon, Marseille. "He was helping them," Ruth said softly, staring at the list. "All these people, he was helping them hide their valuables." "And then the war ended," Harold added, "but he never gave anything back. Why?" Ruth shook her head. "Maybe they never came for it. Maybe they couldn't." The weight of that thought settled over them both. Families scattered, killed, erased by the Holocaust. Valuables entrusted to a stranger who had kept his promise long past the point when anyone was left to receive them. On the fourth day, Ruth found the Bible. It was in the chapel, a small stone room attached to the east wing that they had overlooked in their initial search. The altar was dusty, the pews rotting, but on a stand near the front sat a massive leather-bound Bible, its pages edged in gold. Ruth opened it carefully, and a piece of paper fluttered out. She caught it before it hit the ground. It was a note, written in English, in a hand she now recognized as Augustine's. "For whoever remains, I have kept my promise. I have protected what was entrusted to me, but I am old now, and I fear my time grows short. The truth must not die with me. The key to the highest room lies within these pages. Seek and you shall find. If you are reading this, then you are family. You are the last. What lies above belongs to you now and to those whose names are written in my ledger. Honor them, remember them. Do what I could not. Guard the truth, share the light." Augustine Whitfield, 1979. Ruth's hands shook as she read the note aloud. 1979. That's when he sealed the attic. He left this for us, for whoever came after. "The key is in the Bible," Harold said. "He said it's within these pages." They searched carefully, turning each page, checking the binding, feeling for anything hidden in the leather cover. It was Ruth who finally found it. A small slit cut into the spine, invisible unless you knew to look. She worked her fingers inside and pulled out a piece of cloth wrapped around something hard. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a key. It was iron, old, heavy in her palm. The handle was decorated with the same crest as the lock upstairs. Flowers, vines, the Whitfield family symbol. "Harold," she whispered, "this is it." He took it from her, turning it over in his hands. 800 years of history, reduced to a single piece of metal. "We can open it," he said. "We can finally see what he was protecting." They climbed the stairs again that night, the key clutched in Harold's hand. The corridor was darker now, the sun long since set. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting through the shadows, illuminating the dust that swirled with every step. The door loomed before them. The wooden planks, the iron brackets, the twin locks, one modern, one ancient. "We still need to get through the boards," Ruth said, "and the padlock." Harold had brought tools from the village, a crowbar, a hacksaw, a hammer. He set to work on the padlock first, the hacksaw screaming against metal. It took nearly 20 minutes, but finally the lock gave way, clattering to the floor. The boards were harder. The nails had rusted into the wood, fused by decades of moisture and time. Harold's arms ached, his back screamed, but he kept working, prying each plank free one by one, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the tower. Ruth gathered the boards as they fell, stacking them against the wall. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were Harold's labored breathing and the groan of wood surrendering to force. Finally, the last board came free. Harold stepped back, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. Before them stood the door, bare now, nothing between them and the lock but the ancient iron mechanism. Ruth stepped forward. She took the key from Harold's trembling hand. "Together," she said. He nodded and placed his hand over hers. Together, they inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a sound like a sigh, like something that had been holding its breath for 80 years, finally exhaling. The lock clicked open. Ruth pushed the door. It swung inward slowly, hinges groaning, releasing a rush of air that was cold, dry, and ancient. Their flashlights cut into the darkness beyond. For a moment, they couldn't see anything. Just shadows, shapes, the suggestion of objects hidden in the gloom. Then, Harold's beam landed on something that made him stop breathing. Gold, stacked in neat rows along the walls. Bars of it, coins of it, jewelry spilling from open boxes. The light caught the metal and threw it back, filling the room with a warm, impossible glow. Ruth's flashlight found more. Paintings leaning against the walls. Old masters, she realized, recognizing styles from museum visits decades ago. Sculptures on pedestals, silver candlesticks, crystal chandeliers wrapped in cloth. And in the center of the room, a desk. On the desk, a ledger. Harold walked toward it in a trance. His feet moved without his permission. His hand reached out, trembling, and opened the book. Names, hundreds of names, families, addresses, dates, and beside each name, an inventory. Gold bars, quantity 12. Diamond necklace, value estimated 30,000 francs. Painting, Vermeer, authenticated 1897. "Oh my God!" Ruth breathed behind him. "Harold, oh my God!" He turned to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's all here," she said. "Everything those families gave him. He kept it all. He kept it safe for 80 years. Harold looked around the room, at the fortune surrounding them, at the weight of history pressing down from every corner. $265 million. That's what the experts would later estimate. $265 million in gold, art, and artifacts, hidden in an attic by a man who had made a promise and refused to break it. But Harold didn't see money. He didn't see fortune or inheritance or a solution to their debts. He saw names in a ledger. He saw families erased by hatred. He saw a man who had carried a burden alone for nearly a century, waiting for someone to come and finally set it free. "What do we do?" Ruth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Harold closed the ledger gently, reverently. "We do what he asked," he said. "We honor them. We remember them." He looked at his wife, this woman who had stood beside him through everything, who had never stopped believing in tomorrow. "And then we figure out how to give it back." They stood there together in the golden light, two ordinary people holding an extraordinary truth. And somewhere, in the silence of that ancient room, it felt like Augustin Whitfield was finally at peace. The night stretched long around them as they sat on the cold stone floor of the attic, surrounded by treasures that had waited 8 decades for discovery. Ruth leaned against Harold's shoulder, her flashlight dimmed to save battery, the darkness pressing close. Neither of them had the strength to climb back down the stairs, not yet, not while the enormity of what they'd found still pulsed through their veins like electricity. "I keep thinking about them," Ruth said quietly. "All those families, they gave Augustin everything they had because they trusted him, and then they never came back." Harold nodded slowly. He was holding the ledger in his lap, his fingers resting on the worn leather cover. Some of them must have survived. The war ended. People came home. Why didn't they come for their things? "Maybe they didn't know where to look," Ruth suggested. "The world was chaos after the war, records destroyed, families scattered. Maybe they thought everything was lost. Or maybe Augustin couldn't find them." Harold's voice was heavy. "Maybe he tried, and there was no one left to find." They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of history pressing down on them. Outside, the wind howled against the tower walls, a sound that had echoed through this room for 800 years. Finally, Ruth spoke again. "We have to find them, Harold. Whoever's left, their children, their grandchildren, this belongs to them. I know, he squeezed her hand. I know it does. But even as he said it, he understood the impossibility of the task. Hundreds of names, families scattered across the world, if they existed at all. 80 years of silence, of separation, of loss, and $350,000 in back taxes due in 6 months. Let's go down, he said finally. We need to sleep. We need to think. They made their way back down the winding stairs, moving slowly, carefully, their flashlights cutting pale circles in the darkness. The castle felt different now, no longer just an abandoned ruin, but a vault, a sanctuary, a monument to one man's impossible promise. That night, lying in Augustine's old bed, Ruth dreamed of trains, of families clutching suitcases, pressing valuables into the hands of strangers, begging them to keep these things safe until we return. She dreamed of children who never grew old, of homes that stood empty, of a man sitting alone in a castle, waiting for someone who would never come. She woke with tears on her cheeks and Harold's arms around her. I had the same dream, he whispered. I think we both did. The next morning, they called Monsieur Delacroix. The notary arrived within 2 hours, his face carefully neutral as he climbed the tower stairs behind them. But when they opened the attic door, when his flashlight swept across the rows of gold and the stacks of paintings and the jewelry spilling from ancient boxes, his composure shattered. Mon Dieu, he breathed. Mon Dieu, c'est impossible. He walked through the room in a daze, touching nothing, just looking. When he reached the desk, when he opened the ledger and saw the names, the inventories, the meticulous records Augustin had kept for nearly a century, he sat down heavily in the old wooden chair. I have heard stories my whole life, he said quietly, rumors about what Augustin Whitfield was hiding, but I never believed. He trailed off, shaking his head. This changes everything. We need to find them, Ruth said firmly. The families, or whoever's left. Delacroix looked up at her, something shifting in his eyes. Madame, you understand that legally all of this belongs to you. You inherited the estate and its contents. You have no obligation. I know what the law says, Ruth interrupted, but the law isn't the same as what's right. The notary studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. Your great-uncle chose his heir well, Monsieur Whitfield, he said to Harold. Augustin would be proud. They spent the next several hours documenting everything. Delacroix photographed each item, recorded each entry in the ledger, made notes about provenance and estimated values. The total, when he finally calculated it, made him sit down again. $265 million, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Perhaps more. Some of these paintings alone. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Harold looked at Ruth. She looked back at him, and in that look, a decision was made. We're not keeping it, Harold said. We'll use some to pay the back taxes, to restore the castle, but the rest goes back to where it belongs. That will be complicated, Delacroix said carefully. Tracing descendants, verifying claims, navigating international law. It could take years, decades even. Then we'd better start now, Ruth said. The notary nodded slowly. I know people, historians, genealogists, lawyers who specialize in restitution cases. I will make calls. And the castle? Harold asked. What happens to it? Delacroix considered. Perhaps a museum, a memorial, something that tells this story, honors these families, keeps Augustin's promise alive for future generations. Ruth's eyes lit up. Yes, that's exactly what it should be. They walked out of the attic as the afternoon sun slanted through the tower windows, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Behind them, the door stood open for the first time in 45 years. The truth was out now. The secret was free. And Harold and Ruth Whitfield, two retired Americans who had come to France with nothing but questions, now carried the weight of something far greater than gold. They carried a legacy. They carried a promise. They carried the names of hundreds of families who had trusted a stranger with everything they had, and they were determined to make it right. That evening, sitting in the café in Saint-Émile-sur-Loire, surrounded by villagers who had heard the news and come to see the Americans for themselves, Harold raised a glass of wine. "To Augustin Whitfield," he said, "who kept his promise." "To Augustin," the villagers echoed. Ruth squeezed her husband's hand under the table. Outside, the castle rose against the darkening sky, no longer a ruin, no longer a mystery. It was a beacon now, a testament, a reminder of what one person could protect when they refused to give up. And somewhere, in the golden silence of the attic, it felt like the waiting was finally over. The news spread like wildfire through dry grass. Within 48 hours of Monsieur Delacroix's phone calls, the quiet village of Saint-Émile-sur-Loire transformed into something unrecognizable. Vans with satellite dishes appeared on the cobblestone streets. Reporters in expensive coats knocked on doors, asking questions in broken French and offering money for information. Photographers with long lenses positioned themselves on hillsides, trying to capture images of the castle that had suddenly become the most talked-about place in Europe. Harold stood at the window of their bedroom in the East Wing, watching another news truck rumble up the dirt road. He counted 7 of them now, parked in a ragged line along the fence that separated the castle grounds from the public road. "They're multiplying," he said quietly. Ruth joined him at the window, her hand finding his. "Delacroix warned us this would happen. He said the moment we filed the official inventory, it would become public record." "I know," Harold sighed. "I just didn't expect it to happen so fast." The headline had broken on a French news channel the night before. American couple discovers $265 million in hidden Nazi-era treasure. Within hours, it had been picked up by networks around the world. CNN, BBC, Sky News, Al Jazeera, everyone wanted the story of the elderly couple from Tennessee who had bought a castle for back taxes and found a fortune in the attic. Harold's phone had rung 43 times since sunrise. He'd stopped answering after the 7th call. "We need to make a statement," Ruth said. "Something official, before they start making up their own stories." Harold nodded slowly. She was right, of course. She usually was. The silence was being filled with speculation, and speculation had a way of becoming truth if you let it fester long enough. "I'll call Delacroix," he said. "See if he can set something up." The press conference was held in the village square 2 days later. Monsieur Delacroix had arranged for a small platform to be erected in front of the town hall, with microphones and speakers borrowed from the local church. The mayor of Saint-Émile-sur-Loire stood to one side, looking simultaneously proud and overwhelmed. Reporters filled the square, their cameras pointed like weapons at the 2 elderly Americans who stood behind the podium, blinking in the autumn sunlight. Harold cleared his throat. His hands were shaking, and he gripped the podium to steady them. "My name is Harold Whitfield," he began, his voice rough with nerves. "This is my wife, Ruth. A few weeks ago, we inherited a castle we didn't know existed, from a great-uncle we never met. We came to France expecting to sign some papers and go home. Instead, we found something we never could have imagined." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, the flashing cameras, the microphones thrust toward him like hungry mouths. "In the attic of Château de la Pierre Dorée, sealed for over 40 years, we discovered a collection of gold, artwork, jewelry, and other valuables estimated at approximately $265 million. But more important than the treasure itself is what it represents." Ruth stepped forward, her voice steadier than her husband's. "These items were not my husband's family heirlooms," she said. "They were entrusted to Augustin Whitfield by Jewish families fleeing Nazi persecution during World War II. Families who gave everything they had to a man they trusted, hoping to reclaim their possessions when the war ended. She paused, her voice cracking slightly. Many of those families never came back. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "We have discovered a ledger," Ruth continued, "containing the names of over 300 families who entrusted their valuables to Augustin. Our intention is to work with historians, genealogists, and legal experts to identify the descendants of these families and return what rightfully belongs to them." The questions came like a flood. "Mr. Whitfield, are you saying you're giving away $265 million? Mrs. Whitfield, how do you respond to claims that the French government should take possession of the treasure? What about the back taxes on the property? How will you pay those? Is it true that you were bankrupt before this discovery?" Harold held up his hands. "We're not here to answer every question. We're here to tell the truth. Yes, we came to France nearly broke. Yes, we owe significant back taxes on this property. But we didn't come here looking for treasure. We came looking for answers about a family member we never knew. What we found instead was a responsibility, and we intend to honor it." The press conference lasted another 30 minutes. By the end, Harold's voice was hoarse and Ruth was leaning against him for support. But they had said what needed to be said. Now came the hard part. The first government official arrived the next morning. His name was Pierre Laurent, and he introduced himself as a representative of the French Ministry of Culture. He was tall, thin, with silver hair and the kind of practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Monsieur and Madame Whitfield," he said, settling into a chair in what had once been Augustin's study, "I bring greetings from the ministry and our sincere congratulations on your remarkable discovery." "Thank you," Harold said cautiously. "However," Laurent continued, his smile tightening, "you must understand that a discovery of this magnitude raises certain questions. Legal questions, historical questions, questions of national heritage." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "What kind of questions?" Laurent spread his hands in a gesture of false openness. "The Château de la Pierre Dorée is a 12th-century structure, classified as a monument historique. Anything found within its walls could be considered part of France's cultural patrimony. The ministry has a responsibility to ensure that such treasures are properly preserved, properly studied, and properly administered." "Administered," Harold repeated flatly. "Indeed. There are procedures, you understand. Protocols. The items in your attic may need to be transferred to state custody for evaluation. It could take years to determine proper ownership, and in the meantime, Ruth interrupted, "you want to take everything." Laurent's smile flickered. "Madam, please, no one is taking anything. We are simply ensuring that French law is respected. These items were hidden on French soil during a period of occupation. There are treaties, international agreements regarding cultural property displaced during wartime. These items," Ruth said, her voice cold and steady, "belong to families who were murdered by Nazis, families who trusted a man to keep their belongings safe until they could return. Many of them never returned because they were killed in concentration camps." She leaned forward. "And you want to tie this up in bureaucracy for years while their descendants wait?" The room went silent. Laurent's composure cracked just for a moment. Then he recovered, straightening his tie. "I can see you feel strongly about this matter, madame, but feelings do not supersede law. I will be in touch with formal documentation of the ministry's position." He stood, nodded curtly, and left. When the door closed behind him, Harold let out a long breath. "That's not the last we'll see of him." "No," Ruth agreed, "it's not." 3 days later the lawyers arrived, not one lawyer, not two. 17 different legal representatives showed up at the chateau over the course of a single week, each claiming to represent a different interested party. There was a lawyer from the Claims Conference, an international organization dedicated to securing restitution for Holocaust survivors. There was a representative from the World Jewish Congress. There were attorneys claiming to represent specific families whose names appeared in Augustine's ledger, though Harold suspected many of these claims were fraudulent, opportunists hoping to grab a piece of the fortune. There was even a lawyer from a distant branch of the Whitfield family tree, a third cousin twice removed, who had somehow learned of the inheritance and was now claiming that Harold had no right to the estate at all. "This is a circus," Harold muttered, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents, each one more confusing than the last. Ruth poured him a cup of coffee, their fifth pot of the day. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." "How do you know?" She smiled tiredly. "Because that's how life works, Harold. You know that as well as I do." The reporters hadn't left either. If anything, their numbers had grown. Every day brought new stories, new angles, new speculation. One tabloid claimed that Harold and Ruth were secret art dealers who had known about the treasure all along. Another suggested that Augustin Whitfield had been a Nazi collaborator who had stolen the items himself. That one hurt the most. "They didn't know him," Ruth said, her voice breaking when she read the headline. "They didn't read his journals, his letters. They didn't see how he lived alone for decades, protecting a promise he never broke." Harold put his arm around her. "We know the truth. That's what matters." But the truth, he was learning, mattered less than narrative. And the narrative was spinning out of their control. What happens next will test everything this couple believes in, force them to make impossible choices, and show the world what it truly means to keep a promise across generations. Stay tuned to see how they fight back. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Her name was Miriam Goldstein, and she was 89 years old. She lived in a small apartment in Tel Aviv, surrounded by photographs of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She had survived Auschwitz as a teenager, losing her parents, her brothers, and everyone she had ever loved. Miriam had seen the news reports about the chateau and the treasure. She had watched the press conference, studied the photographs of the attic and its contents. And then she had picked up the phone and called the number that Monsieur Delacroix had provided for potential claimants. "My mother's name was Sarah Abramowitz," she said, her voice thin but steady over the international line. "She was from Lyon. In 1942, when the roundups began, she gave everything we had to a man she worked with, a French accountant who promised to keep it safe. She said his family had a castle somewhere in the countryside." Ruth was crying before Miriam finished speaking. "We have the ledger," Ruth said. "We have your mother's name. Abramowitz, Sarah, Lyon, 1942. Gold coins, quantity 47. Diamond brooch, family heirloom. Silver candlesticks pair." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "She always talked about those candlesticks," Miriam finally said. "They belonged to my grandmother. Lit every Shabbat for 3 generations. I thought they were lost forever." "They're not lost," Ruth said. "They're here. They've been waiting for you." The first restitution ceremony was held 6 weeks later. Miriam Goldstein flew to France with her daughter, her granddaughter, and her 2 great-grandchildren. The ceremony was held in the great hall of the chateau, now cleaned and restored enough to host guests. Reporters were allowed in, but only those who agreed to treat the moment with the dignity it deserved. Harold stood beside the table where Miriam's family heirlooms had been arranged, the gold coins, the diamond brooch, and the silver candlesticks, polished until they gleamed. Miriam approached slowly, supported by her granddaughter's arm. She was tiny, frail, her hair white as snow, but her eyes were sharp, filled with decades of memory and loss. She reached out and touched the candlesticks. Her fingers traced the familiar patterns, the worn edges where generations of hands had held them. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember my mother lighting them. I remember the prayers, the songs, the smell of challah baking." Tears streamed down her face. "I was 14 when they took us. I never saw her again." Ruth stepped forward and took Miriam's hands in hers. "Your mother kept her promise. She trusted Augustine Whitfield with everything she had, and he kept his promise too. For 80 years he protected what she gave him." Miriam looked up at Ruth, this American stranger who had traveled across an ocean to deliver a piece of her childhood back to her. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for finishing what he started." The moment was captured by every camera in the room. The photograph of Miriam holding her mother's candlesticks, tears streaming down her face, would become iconic, a symbol of what restitution could mean, of what justice looked like when people chose to do the right thing. But for Harold and Ruth, it wasn't about photographs or symbols. It was about this one woman, this one family, this one moment of restoration in a sea of irreparable loss. It was only the beginning. Over the following months, the work continued. Delacroix had assembled a team of researchers, historians, and genealogists who worked tirelessly to trace the descendants of the families in Augustine's ledger. It was painstaking, heartbreaking work. Some families had been completely erased, entire bloodlines wiped out by the Holocaust, leaving no one to claim what had been lost. For those items, Harold and Ruth worked with Holocaust memorial organizations to ensure they would be preserved as testimony, as evidence of lives that had been lived and loved before being cruelly destroyed. Other families were found scattered across the world, in Israel, in America, in Argentina, in Australia. Children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories of lost fortunes dismissed as family myths suddenly discovered that the stories were real. Each restitution was its own ceremony, its own moment of healing. A painting returned to a family in Brooklyn. A jewelry collection delivered to survivors in Haifa. Gold bars converted to cash and distributed to foundations that supported Holocaust education. The French government continued to complicate things. Pierre Laurent became a regular presence, arriving with new documents, new objections, new legal theories about why the state should control the process. Harold and Ruth fought back with their own lawyers, their own documents, their own arguments. "This is not about law," Ruth said during one particularly heated meeting. "This is about morality. These items were stolen by Nazis, hidden by a righteous man, and now they're being returned to the people they belong to. France should be celebrating this, not obstructing it." Laurent had no response to that. The cameras were rolling. Public opinion, as it turned out, was firmly on the side of Harold and Ruth Whitfield. The more the government pushed, the more the people pushed back. Petitions circulated demanding that the ministry withdraw its objections. Editorials appeared in major newspapers calling the official position a second theft and an insult to the memory of the victims. Eventually, reluctantly, the ministry backed down. The back taxes were paid from the sale of items for which no owners could be found, pieces that had been entrusted by families completely destroyed in the Holocaust, with no descendants left to claim them. It felt wrong to profit from such loss, but it also felt wrong to let the castle fall into government hands when it could serve a greater purpose. The legal settlement with the ministry included an agreement to transform the chateau into a museum and memorial. The attic would be preserved as it was found, a testament to one man's impossible promise. The story of Augustine Whitfield would be told alongside the stories of the families he had protected. The distant cousin who had challenged Harold's inheritance quietly withdrew his claim after his lawyers advised him that public sympathy was overwhelmingly against him. He disappeared back into obscurity, never to be heard from again. One by one, the complications resolved themselves. Not easily, not quickly, but steadily. And through it all, Harold and Ruth remained at the center. Two ordinary people navigating an extraordinary situation with grace, patience, and an unwavering moral compass. "I don't understand how you stay so calm," a reporter asked Ruth during one of the many interviews they gave. Ruth smiled. "I'm not calm, honey. I'm terrified most of the time. But my mother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when you're scared to death." And you believe returning this treasure is the right thing? Ruth looked at her, this young woman with her microphone and her questions, trying to understand. "Let me tell you something," Ruth said. "Harold and I have been married 51 years. We raised 3 children on factory wages and side jobs. We've never had money, never had security, never had the luxury of thinking about tomorrow when today was hard enough." She paused. "When we found that treasure, we could have kept it. Legally, it was ours. We could have paid off every debt, bought a mansion, lived like royalty for whatever years we have left. But you didn't. No. Because those items weren't ours. They never were. They belonged to people who suffered more than we can imagine, who trusted a stranger with everything they had, who died hoping their children might someday get it back." Ruth's voice grew thick with emotion. "We're not heroes. We're just 2 old people trying to do what those families would have wanted." The reporter was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you have any regrets?" Ruth shook her head. "Not one." By the end of the first year, nearly a third of the items had been returned to verified descendants. The ceremonies had become routine now, still emotional, still meaningful, but no longer the media spectacles they had once been. The world had moved on to other stories, other scandals, other treasures. But the work continued. Harold's health had begun to decline. The stress of the past year, the travel, the endless meetings and legal battles, it had taken a toll. His heart, never strong to begin with, was showing signs of strain. The doctors in Lyon had warned him to slow down. "You're 75 years old," the cardiologist had said. "You need rest, Monsieur Whitfield, real rest." But rest felt impossible when there were still names in the ledger, still families waiting to be found, still promises to keep. "You're stubborn," Ruth told him one evening as they sat in the restored Great Hall, watching the sunset through windows that had been cleaned for the first time in decades. "I learned it from you," Harold replied with a tired smile. She took his hand. "We don't have to do this alone, you know. Delacroix has a whole team now. The foundation is established. The work will continue even if we step back." "I know." He squeezed her fingers. "But I want to see it through, as much as I can." Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then we'll see it through together, like we always have." Outside, the hills of Burgundy rolled away toward the horizon, golden in the evening light. The castle stood solid and ancient around them, its walls holding 800 years of history and one man's extraordinary secret. Augustin Whitfield had died alone, but he hadn't been forgotten. His promise had been kept, his legacy lived on. And in the quiet of that restored hall, 2 elderly Americans from Tennessee sat holding hands, knowing that whatever time they had left, they had used it well. The second year brought more discoveries. Behind a false wall in the wine cellar, they found crates of documents that Augustin had hidden separately from the main treasure. These papers told a darker story, records of the Nazi occupation, lists of collaborators, evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted. "This needs to go to the authorities," Delacroix said, his face pale as he reviewed the documents. "This could reopen cases that have been closed for decades." Harold nodded slowly. "Then it goes to the authorities." Some of the names in those documents were still alive, elderly men who had lived comfortable lives, never held accountable for what they had done during the war. The evidence from Augustin's cellar changed that. Trials were held, convictions were secured. Men in their 90s were finally forced to answer for crimes they had committed in their 20s. It wasn't justice, not really. Too much time had passed. Too many victims had died without seeing their persecutors punished. But it was something. A small measure of accountability in a world that too often let the guilty go free. "Augustin knew," Ruth said one evening, reading through his journals for the 100th time. He knew who had collaborated, who had betrayed their neighbors, who had profited from the suffering of others. He kept records of everything. "Why didn't he come forward?" Harold asked. Ruth turned another page. I think he was afraid that if he exposed them, they would come for him, come for the treasure, destroy everything he had protected. So he stayed silent. He stayed silent and he waited for someone else to finish what he couldn't. Harold looked at the journal, at the careful handwriting of a man who had carried impossible burdens for nearly a century. "He waited for us," he said quietly. Ruth nodded. "He waited for us." The museum opened on a bright spring day, exactly 2 years after Harold and Ruth had first arrived in France. Dignitaries came from around the world, Holocaust survivors and their descendants, historians and journalists, ordinary people who had followed the story and wanted to see where it had happened. The attic had been preserved exactly as it was found, accessible now by a restored staircase and protected by glass barriers. Visitors could see the rows of gold, the stacks of paintings, the jewelry spilling from ancient boxes. They could read the names in Augustine's ledger, displayed on screens that showed photographs of the families when they were available. In the great hall below, a permanent exhibition told the full story: the Whitfield family's emigration to America, Augustine's solitary vigil, the decades of hiding, the discovery, the restitution. And at the center of it all, a bronze plaque with words that Ruth had written herself. "In memory of Augustine Whitfield, 1897 to 1994, who kept a promise for 80 years and taught us that some treasures cannot be measured in gold." Harold stood before the plaque, his hand resting on Ruth's shoulder. Around them, visitors moved through the exhibition, speaking in hushed voices, some of them crying. "We did it," Ruth whispered. "We actually did it." Harold nodded, unable to speak. His throat was too tight, his heart too full. They had come to France with nothing but questions and doubt. They had found a treasure beyond imagining and given most of it away. They had fought governments and lawyers and skeptics. They had worked harder in their 70s than they had in their 40s. And now, standing in this restored castle, surrounded by the evidence of what one person's integrity could accomplish, they understood that they had done something that would outlast them both. The treasure was important, but the story was everything. "Monsieur Whitfield!" a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find a young woman standing nearby, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and familiar eyes. "My name is Anna Goldstein," she said. "Miriam Goldstein is my great-grandmother." Harold smiled. "I remember her. The candlesticks." Anna nodded, her eyes glistening. "She passed away last month, peacefully in her sleep, but before she died she asked me to give you something." She held out a small package wrapped in cloth. Harold took it carefully and unwrapped it. Inside was a photograph. Miriam as a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, standing with her mother. They were smiling, caught in a moment of ordinary happiness, and in the background, barely visible, were the silver candlesticks on a table set for Shabbat dinner. "She wanted you to have this," Anna said. "She said you gave her back her mother. This was her way of sharing that gift with you." Harold stared at the photograph, at the faces of people he had never met but felt he knew. His hands trembled. "Thank you," he managed to say. Anna smiled. "No, Monsieur Whitfield. Thank you. Thank you for everything." She walked away, disappearing into the crowd of visitors. Harold stood motionless, holding the photograph, tears running down his weathered cheeks. Ruth took his arm. "Come on, old man, let's go home." Home. The word had a different meaning now. Home was still the cottage in Cedar Falls, with its cracked linoleum and leaking roof. But home was also here, in this castle on a French hillside, where two ordinary people had discovered what it meant to be extraordinary. They walked out of the great hall together, arm in arm, leaving the museum to its visitors and its memories. Outside, the spring sun was warm on their faces. The hills were green with new growth, and somewhere in the attic above, the last of the gold sat waiting for owners who might still be found. The work wasn't finished. It might never be finished. But that was okay. Some promises take a lifetime to keep, and some promises outlast lifetimes altogether. The third year began with a phone call that changed everything. Harold was sitting in the small office they had set up in the East Wing, reviewing reports from the genealogical team, when Delacroix's name appeared on his phone screen. He answered on the second ring, expecting another update about a traced family or a legal complication. Instead, the notary's voice was tight with barely contained excitement. "Monsieur Whitfield, I need you and Madame Ruth to come to my office immediately. There has been a discovery, something extraordinary." Harold frowned. "More extraordinary than what we've already found?" Delacroix paused. "Yes, monsieur, I believe so." An hour later, Harold and Ruth sat in the notary's cramped office in the village, surrounded by stacks of documents and the familiar smell of old paper and coffee. Delacroix stood at his desk, holding a folder as if it contained something fragile. "During our ongoing research into Augustine's records," he began, "we discovered a secondary ledger. It was hidden inside the binding of a book in the library, a copy of Les Miserables that had been hollowed out. We believe Augustine concealed it separately as a backup, in case the main ledger was ever found and destroyed." He opened the folder and spread several pages across his desk. "This secondary ledger contains additional information that was not in the original. Specifically, it contains detailed provenance documentation for certain items in the collection, items that Augustine identified as having particular historical significance." Ruth leaned forward. "What kind of significance?" Delacroix took a breath. "Some of the artwork in your attic, Madame Whitfield, was not simply family heirlooms or personal possessions. According to Augustine's notes, several pieces were part of collections that were being smuggled out of Germany in the late 1930s, rescued from museums that the Nazis were planning to loot or destroy." Harold felt his chest tighten. "Rescued artwork?" "Yes, monsieur. We have identified at least 7 paintings that appear to have been part of what historians call the degenerate art collection, works that the Nazi regime deemed unacceptable and ordered destroyed, expressionist pieces, modernist works, paintings by artists who were Jewish or politically undesirable." He pulled out a photograph of a small canvas that Harold vaguely remembered seeing in the attic, a swirling portrait in blues and oranges that he had assumed was simply abstract. "This painting," Delacroix said quietly, "is by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. It was believed to have been destroyed in 1937. Its current estimated value is between $12 and $15 million. But its historical value," he shook his head, "incalculable." Ruth's hand found Harold's. "How did Augustine get it?" "According to his notes, it was given to him by a German art dealer named Heinrich Vogel, who was part of an underground network smuggling condemned artwork out of the Reich. Vogel was eventually arrested and died in a concentration camp. But before his capture, he managed to get several pieces to trusted contacts in France." Delacroix spread more photographs across the desk. Painting after painting, each one with a story of escape, of persecution, of art that should have been ash but had instead survived in a French attic for nearly a century. "There are 17 pieces total that we have identified as rescued artwork," Delacroix said. "Some have known provenance and can potentially be returned to the families or institutions they were taken from. Others," he paused, "others were owned by people who did not survive. Artists who were killed, collectors who disappeared, galleries that were seized and never reopened." Harold stared at the photographs, his mind struggling to process the implications. This wasn't just about gold and jewelry anymore. This was about cultural heritage, about art that the Nazis had tried to erase from existence, about the survival of human creativity against the machinery of destruction. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. Delacroix looked at him with something like admiration. "That, Monsieur Whitfield, is entirely up to you." The debate over the rescued artwork lasted for months. Museums around the world expressed interest. The Metropolitan in New York, the Tate in London, the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. All of them reached out with proposals for acquisition or long-term loans. Private collectors offered staggering sums, enough to fund the foundation's work for generations. But Harold and Ruth were not interested in selling. These paintings survived because people risked their lives to save them, Ruth said during one particularly heated meeting with potential buyers. Heinrich Vogel died in a concentration camp protecting this art. We're not going to auction it off to the highest bidder like it's just another commodity. The solution they eventually reached was a compromise that satisfied almost no one and honored almost everyone. The paintings with verifiable original owners, or whose owners' descendants could be traced, were returned. A Kirchner went back to the family of a German Jewish collector who had fled to Argentina in 1938. A Kandinsky was restored to a museum in Munich that had been forced to surrender it during the Nazi regime. The paintings whose owners had been completely erased, killed without descendants, their families annihilated, were placed on permanent loan to Holocaust memorial museums around the world. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem received 3 pieces. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington received 2. Others went to institutions in Amsterdam, Berlin, and Budapest. None of them were sold. None of them became private property. They remained, technically, part of the Whitfield estate, held in trust for the memory of those who had created them and those who had died trying to save them. Art isn't property, Ruth told a reporter who questioned their decision. It's testimony. These paintings are witnesses. You don't sell witnesses, you let them speak. The quote made headlines around the world. Harold's health continued to decline throughout the 4th year. The heart condition that had been manageable became less so. He spent more time in hospitals, more time in waiting rooms, more time attached to machines that beeped and hummed and measured the failing rhythm of a body that had worked hard for 77 years. Ruth never left his side. When he was in the hospital, she slept in chairs beside his bed. When he was home, she monitored his medications, his diet, his energy levels, with the fierce attention of someone who refused to lose the battle she knew she was already losing. "You're hovering," Harold complained one afternoon as she adjusted his blankets for the 3rd time in an hour. "I'm caring," she corrected. "There's a difference." The difference is about 6 inches of personal space. She smiled, despite herself. Even now, even sick, he could make her laugh. That was the thing about 53 years of marriage. You learned each other so completely that even the hard parts had their own kind of grace. "The foundation wants to hold another ceremony next month," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "They've found the family of a violin that was in the collection. It belonged to a concert pianist from Vienna named David Rosenthal. He gave it to a student before he was deported to Theresienstadt." "Did he survive?" Ruth shook her head. "No, but his student did. She emigrated to America after the war, became a music teacher in Ohio. Her grandson is a violinist with the Cleveland Orchestra now." Harold closed his eyes. "That's a good story. They want you to present it, the violin." He was quiet for a long moment. When he opened his eyes, they were glistening. "I don't know if I can, Ruth. I don't know how many more ceremonies I have in me." She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his the way they had 10,000 times before. "Then we'll do it together," she said. "Like we always have." The violin ceremony was held on a clear autumn day, the hills around the chateau blazing with color. Harold was in a wheelchair now. His pride had objected, but his legs had objected louder. Ruth pushed him across the great hall to the small stage where the violin waited in its case, surrounded by photographs of David Rosenthal and his student, a young woman named Anna Fisher who had carried her teacher's memory across an ocean and a lifetime. The grandson, Michael Fisher, 34 years old, with his great-grandmother's eyes and his great-great-teacher's gift, stood waiting. His hands were trembling. "This violin," Harold said, his voice weaker than it had once been, but still steady, still clear, "belonged to a man named David Rosenthal. He was born in Vienna in 1892. He performed in concert halls across Europe. He taught students who went on to perform in concert halls across the world. He paused, gathering strength. In 1938, when the Nazis annexed Austria, David knew what was coming. He gave this violin to his most promising student, Anna Fischer, and told her to run. She did. She made it to America. She taught music for 40 years. She never forgot where her gift came from. Harold gestured to Michael. This young man is her grandson. He plays violin with one of the finest orchestras in America, and today we return to him a piece of his family's history. Ruth opened the case. Inside, the violin gleamed, its wood dark with age, its strings replaced but its soul intact. She lifted it carefully and placed it in Michael's hands. He held it like something holy. Then, without a word, he raised it to his shoulder, tucked it beneath his chin, and began to play. The music that filled the great hall was unlike anything Harold had ever heard. It was grief and joy and loss and hope, all woven together in notes that seemed to come not just from the violin, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere that connected this moment to all the moments that had come before. Harold wept openly. So did Ruth. So did everyone in the room. When the last note faded, when the silence had stretched long enough to hold all the weight it needed to hold, Michael lowered the violin and looked at Harold. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for bringing him home." Harold nodded, unable to speak. That night, lying in bed in the east wing of the chateau, he told Ruth something he had never said before. "I'm not afraid anymore." She turned to look at him, her face silver in the moonlight. "Afraid of what?" "Of dying." He reached for her hand. "I used to be terrified. All those years working at the mill, raising the kids, struggling to keep our heads above water. I was always afraid that I would die before I accomplished anything that mattered." He squeezed her fingers. "I'm not afraid anymore. We did something that mattered, Ruth. We really did." She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder the way she had 1,000,000 times before. "We're not done yet, old man. Don't you go giving up on me." He smiled in the darkness. "Never." But they both knew the truth. The hourglass was running low. Every grain of sand was precious now. The final restitution ceremony was held in June, 5 years after Harold and Ruth had first arrived in France. The chateau had been fully restored now, its towers repaired, its windows replaced, its gardens brought back to life by a team of volunteers from the village who had adopted the project as their own. The museum welcomed 10,000 visitors a month. The foundation had returned items to over 200 families across 4 continents, and the ledger, Augustine's careful, meticulous ledger, was finally complete. Every name had been researched, every item had been traced, every family that could be found had been contacted, verified, and either reunited with their ancestors' possessions or provided with documentation that allowed them to understand what had been lost. The items for which no owners could be found, perhaps 15% of the original collection, had been donated to Holocaust memorials or kept as part of the chateau's permanent exhibition. Nothing had been sold for profit. Nothing had been hoarded. Nothing had been lost to bureaucracy or greed or the slow erosion of good intentions. It was by any measure a miracle. Harold was 80 years old now. He walked with a cane when he walked at all, which wasn't often. His heart had stabilized somewhat, but everyone knew it was borrowed time. The doctors spoke in careful terms, hedging their predictions, offering neither hope nor despair. He didn't mind. He had stopped measuring his life in years a long time ago. He measured it in moments now. And this moment, this final ceremony, was one he intended to savor. The great hall was filled with people, survivors and their descendants, historians and journalists, villagers who had once whispered about the strange Americans and now counted them as family, dignitaries from a dozen countries, including the French Minister of Culture, who had once sent lawyers to obstruct their work and now stood ready to present them with the nation's highest civilian honor. Harold and Ruth sat together in the front row, holding hands as they always did. Their children were there, all three of them, flown in from across America with their spouses and children. Their grandchildren ran through the crowd, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that it was important. Monsieur Delacroix took the podium. He was older now too, his hair completely white, but his eyes were still sharp, still filled with the intelligence and compassion that had guided them through 5 years of impossible work. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we gather today to mark the completion of a journey that began with a simple letter and led to one of the most remarkable acts of restitution in modern history." He spoke for 20 minutes, outlining the statistics, the challenges, the triumphs. He named families who had been reunited with their heritage. He honored the memory of those who had not survived to see this day. He praised the volunteers, the researchers, the legal team, the villagers who had opened their hearts to strangers. And then he turned to Harold and Ruth. But none of this would have been possible without two people who could have taken a different path. Two people who inherited a fortune and chose to give it away. Two people who were offered comfort and chose instead to serve justice. He smiled, his voice thick with emotion. Harold and Ruth Whitfield did not come to France seeking treasure. They came seeking connection, understanding, perhaps a glimpse of a family history that had been lost to them. What they found instead was a responsibility, a sacred obligation left to them by a man they never knew. He paused. They could have walked away. The law would have protected them. No one would have blamed them. They were elderly. They were struggling. They had every reason to take what was legally theirs and disappear. But they didn't. Delacroix turned to face them directly. "You stayed. You fought. You gave away a fortune that most people would have clung to with both hands. And in doing so, you taught the world something that it desperately needed to learn." He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "On behalf of the French Republic, it is my honor to present you with the Légion d'honneur, France's highest civilian decoration, in recognition of your extraordinary service to the cause of justice and remembrance." The room erupted in applause. Harold struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. Ruth rose beside him, her hand on his arm, steadying him as she always had. Delacroix pinned the medal to Harold's lapel, then Ruth's. The cameras flashed. The applause continued. But Harold wasn't looking at the cameras or the dignitaries or even the medal now resting against his chest. He was looking at Ruth, at this woman who had been his partner for 55 years, who had followed him across an ocean on faith, who had stood beside him through every triumph and every struggle. "We did it," he whispered. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "We did it together." That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the dignitaries had departed, Harold and Ruth walked through the chateau alone. Not really walked. Harold was in his wheelchair again, and Ruth pushed him slowly through the restored corridors, past the portraits they now knew by name, past the library where they had found the first clues, past the chapel where they had discovered the hidden key. They ended, as they always did, at the attic. The stairs had been replaced with a small elevator, a concession to accessibility that Harold had initially resisted and now grudgingly appreciated. They rode up together in silence, the mechanics humming softly around them. The attic door stood open now, as it had for 5 years. The treasures were mostly gone, returned to their rightful owners, donated to museums, preserved as testimony. Only a few items remained, replicas of key pieces, photographs, documentation that told the story of what had been here and where it had gone. But the room itself was unchanged. The same stone walls, the same ancient beams, the same small window that looked out over the hills of Burgundy. The same sense of weight, of history, of secrets held and secrets finally released. Ruth wheeled Harold to the center of the room and sat down beside him on a small bench that had been placed there for visitors. "Do you remember the first time we came up here?" she asked. Harold nodded slowly. "I remember being terrified. All that gold, all those paintings. I kept thinking there must be some mistake, that we'd wake up and it would all be a dream." "And now?" He looked around the room at the empty spaces where treasure had once waited, at the photographs on the walls showing items being returned to weeping families. "Now I know it wasn't a dream. It was a gift." He reached for her hand. Not the gold, not the paintings. The chance to do something that mattered. That was the real treasure. Ruth squeezed his fingers. "Augustine gave us more than money, Harold. He gave us purpose. He gave us a reason to keep going when we thought we had nothing left." "He gave us time," Harold agreed. "Time with a meaning. That's the most valuable thing there is." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky outside the small window in shades of orange and gold. The light fell across the stone floor, warming the ancient wood, turning the dust motes into dancing sparks of fire. "I want to be buried here," Harold said suddenly. Ruth turned to look at him. "What?" "Not instead of home. In addition to home. I want my ashes scattered here, in France, in this chateau. This place changed me, Ruth. It made me who I was supposed to be. I want some part of me to stay." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, "but I'm coming with you." He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." They stayed until the stars came out, two old people holding hands in an ancient room, surrounded by the echoes of everything they had accomplished and everyone they had helped. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected when they'd boarded that plane to France 5 years ago. It was better. It was truer. It was the ending they had earned. Harold Whitfield passed away 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep, in the bedroom of the East Wing where he and Ruth had spent so many nights. Ruth was beside him when he went. She had been beside him for 55 years, and she wasn't about to stop now. The funeral was held in Saint-Émile-sur-Loire, in the small church whose bells they had heard ringing on so many mornings. The village turned out in force, every resident, it seemed, plus hundreds of others who had travelled from around the world to pay their respects. Miriam Goldstein's granddaughter came, carrying the silver candlesticks that had been in her family for generations. Michael Fisher came, carrying the violin that had belonged to David Rosenthal. Families from Israel and Argentina and Australia came, carrying photographs and mementos and memories of what the Whitfields had done for them. The service was simple, as Harold would have wanted. No grand eulogies, no flowery speeches, just honest words about an honest man who had done extraordinary things without ever thinking of himself as extraordinary. Ruth spoke last. She stood at the altar, looking out at the sea of faces, and spoke without notes, without preparation, without anything but the truth. "Harold Whitfield was a factory worker from Tennessee," she said. "He never graduated college. He never made much money. He spent most of his life worried about paying bills and keeping roofs from leaking and making sure our children had shoes that fit." She paused, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "But in the last 5 years of his life, he became something else. He became a guardian, a restorer, a keeper of promises." She looked at the crowd, at the families whose lives had been changed, at the villagers who had become friends, at the children and grandchildren who would carry this story forward. "He used to say that he was nobody special, just an ordinary man who got lucky. But I knew better." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "I knew that what made him special wasn't the treasure he found. It was the treasure he gave away." She looked at the casket, draped in flowers from 3 continents. "I loved him for 55 years, and I will love him for whatever years I have left. Because Harold Whitfield taught me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. It's never too late to do something that matters." She smiled through her tears. "Rest easy, my love. You earned it." Ruth lived for another 4 years. She spent most of that time at the chateau, overseeing the foundation's work, greeting visitors to the museum, telling the story of what she and Harold had discovered and why they had chosen to give it away. She became, in her own way, as famous as her husband. Journalists came to interview her. Documentaries were made about her. Schools invited her to speak. She accepted every invitation, not for the attention, but for the chance to keep telling the truth. "People think the story is about the gold," she would say. "But the story is about the families, about the names in the ledger, about the people who trusted Augustine Whitfield with everything they had, and about the man who kept that trust for 80 years. She would pause, letting that sink in. "We didn't give away a fortune. We returned stolen property. There's a difference, and once you understand that difference, the choice becomes easy." The foundation continued to grow. New projects were launched, educational programs about the Holocaust, scholarships for descendants of survivors, partnerships with museums around the world. The chateau became a pilgrimage site, a place where people came not just to see art and history, but to feel something, to connect with something larger than themselves. Ruth watched it all with quiet pride. She had never wanted fame or recognition. She had only wanted to do right by the people whose names were written in that ledger. And now, finally, she had. On her last day, Ruth asked to be taken to the attic. Her granddaughter, Harold's granddaughter, wheeled her up in the elevator through the corridors they had walked so many times before. The chateau was quiet that evening, closed to visitors, the staff gone home, just Ruth and the ghosts. She sat in the attic for a long time, looking at the photographs on the walls, the documentation that traced where each item had gone. She read the names again, names she knew by heart now, names that had become part of her own story. Sarah Abramowitz, David Rosenthal, Heinrich Vogel, Augustine Whitfield, and now soon Harold and Ruth Whitfield. "We did it," she whispered to the empty room. "We really did it." She closed her eyes and thought about everything that had led to this moment: the letter from France, the crumbling chateau, the sealed attic door, the flash of gold in the flashlight beam, the choice. That was what it all came down to, really. The choice they had made when they could have made a different one, the decision to give instead of take, to serve instead of hoard, to honor the past instead of profit from it. They had been nobody special, just two ordinary people who got lucky, but they had chosen to be extraordinary. Ruth smiled and opened her eyes one last time. The sunset was painting the sky outside the window, the same shades of orange and gold she and Harold had watched so many times together. "I'm coming, old man," she whispered, and then, quietly, peacefully, in the same room where they had discovered their purpose, Ruth Whitfield went home. The memorial service was held on a perfect summer day. People came from around the world, just as they had for Harold. The village church was too small to hold them all, so the service was held in the courtyard of the chateau, beneath a canopy of ancient trees that had stood for 800 years. Ruth's children spoke, her grandchildren spoke, representatives from the foundation and the museum and the families whose lives had been changed spoke. But the words that stayed with everyone came from Monsieur Delacroix, now retired but still dedicated to the mission Ruth and Harold had begun. "Ruth and Harold Whitfield came to France as strangers," he said. "They arrived with nothing but questions, leaving behind a home that was falling apart, a bank account that was nearly empty, and a future that seemed to hold nothing but struggle." He paused, looking out at the crowd. They left as legends. They left having changed the world, having returned a fortune to its rightful owners, having taught millions of people what it means to honor a promise. He smiled, his eyes glistening. "But I think if they were here, they would say that none of that was the point. They would say that the point was the families, the names, the stories." He held up a copy of Augustine's ledger, now preserved under glass in the museum, but reproduced in books that had been distributed to libraries and schools around the world. 327 families, he said. "That's how many names are in this book. 327 families who trusted Augustin Whitfield with their most precious possessions. 327 families who waited 80 years for someone to keep that trust. He lowered the book. Ruth and Harold didn't find a treasure, they found a responsibility, and they rose to meet it. He looked toward the chateau, its towers gleaming in the summer light. This place is their monument, but their true legacy is the peace they brought to hundreds of families who thought they had been forgotten. He turned to face the crowd one final time. Harold used to say that they were nobody special. Ruth would always disagree, and she was right. His voice broke, just slightly. They were the most special people I ever knew, and the world is better because they lived. The ashes were scattered at sunset, half in the garden of the chateau among the roses Ruth had helped to plant, half sent back to Tennessee to be scattered at the cottage in Cedar Falls that had been their home for so many years. The children stayed for a week, helping to sort through belongings, making decisions about what to keep and what to donate. The foundation would continue, run now by a board that included 2 of Ruth's grandchildren and several members of families whose possessions had been returned. The chateau would remain a museum open to the public, telling the story of Augustin Whitfield and the treasure he had protected, of Harold and Ruth Whitfield and the choice they had made. And in the attic, now empty of gold but filled with something more valuable, a small plaque was added to the bronze one that had been there since the museum opened. Ruth and Harold Whitfield, 1951 to 2024 and 1949 to 2028, who taught the world that some treasures cannot be measured in gold, and some promises are worth a lifetime to keep. The Château de la Pierre Dorée still stands on its hillside in Burgundy, its towers reaching toward the sky, its walls holding 8 centuries of history. Visitors come from around the world to walk its corridors, to climb to the attic, to read the names in Augustin's ledger. They come to see the photographs, the documentation, the story of how a forgotten fortune was found and returned. But most of all, they come to learn about 3 people. A man who made a promise and kept it for 80 years, and 2 ordinary Americans who traveled across an ocean to finish what he had started. The gold is gone now, scattered to the families it belonged to, donated to the institutions that will preserve its memory. But something more valuable remains. Hope. The hope that even in a world full of greed and corruption and cruelty, there are still people who choose differently. People who see a fortune and ask not, how can I keep it, but who does it belong to? The hope that promises matter, that integrity matters, that doing the right thing matters, even when no one is watching, even when no one would ever know. The hope that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Harold and Ruth Whitfield didn't set out to become heroes. They set out to pay their property taxes and see a castle they'd inherited from a stranger. But somewhere along the way, they found something more valuable than gold. They found purpose, they found meaning, they found a reason to keep going when they thought they had nothing left to give. And in finding those things, they gave a gift to everyone who heard their story. The knowledge that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, if only they're brave enough to try. The sun sets over Burgundy every evening, painting the hills in shades of orange and gold. The chateau stands silent, waiting for the next day's visitors, the next chapter of its endless story. And somewhere, in the peace that lies beyond time and space and memory, an old man named Augustin Whitfield finally rests easy. His promise was kept. His trust was honored. The treasure he protected for 80 years found its way home, because Harold and Ruth Whitfield finished what he started, and that, in the end, is the only inheritance that truly matters. Anyone can choose to do the right thing if they're willing to let go of what they want and hold on to what's true. Sometimes the greatest fortune isn't what you find buried in an attic or locked in a vault. Sometimes the greatest fortune is the chance to make something right that has been wrong for too long. As the stars appear over the Château de la Pierre Dorée, the same stars that have watched over this place for 800 years, one truth remains. We all have the power to be someone's answer. We all have the power to keep a promise. We all have the power to choose love over greed, justice over profit, others over ourselves. Ruth and Harold Whitfield were 73 and 75 years old when they discovered a fortune worth $265 million. They could have kept it all. Instead, they gave it away. And in doing so, they became richer than they ever could have imagined. Not in gold, not in fame, not in material wealth, in meaning, in purpose, in the knowledge that when their time came, they had done something that mattered. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of everything that's still beautiful in this world. Click to keep riding with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that some promises are worth keeping forever.